Hey there, welcome to a Western Standard special on Alberta Budget Day. I'm not seated with, I still keep getting mistaken with that, but I'm on camera with Franco Terrazzano of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. How you doing today, Franco? This is like kind of a Super Bowl for Tax Federation kind of guys where you can analyze and start talking about what's going on there, eh?
Well, I'm doing good, man, but it wasn't a good day for taxpayers, that's for sure.
No, we don't get a lot of those. But I am going to start off before we drill into all that misery of taxes and such to our show sponsor, because, we got to support our small businesses and those businesses are supporting us. This is Karen's Way, and it's run by Penny. And it's a place like if you've got stress or anxiety issues, past trauma, this is a full holistic service based in Calgary with drug-free ways to help cope with these sorts of things through nutrition and some counseling. So perhaps, if you want to talk to somebody or have a look at some things, check out karensway.com and give a note to Penny. There's free consultations to see if what she offers is right for you. It's certainly a good local service. So, Franco, I'm going to start with what's probably then the shorter answer to begin with as we go into this budget and such. What was good in it?
Yeah, well, that's definitely the shorter answer. Okay, let's start with that. Well, we are seeing the government reduce spending on like some wildly inefficient departments like advanced education, right? So that's universities and colleges. You got to give them kudos there. We did see the Blue Ribbon panel on Alberta's finances. They came back, and one of the big spending items that we have are universities and colleges. Like we're spending thousands of dollars more per student for universities. So it's good to see the government cut some spending in advanced education and find some savings. The Taxpayers Federation, we found some freedom of information requests that showed that thousands of university employees at U of C at the University of Alberta were receiving pay hikes even during the downturn, even during COVID-19. So it's good to see the government start to scale back advanced education.
Well, that's good. Yeah, it's been a long time since I was in any post-secondary school, but even then, some of the bloat and inefficiencies you could see even as a student. I mean, there's room to still have good value and good education that is an investment that's required for us, but they really aren't spending the most efficiently. That's been an area of bloat that people are afraid to touch or talk about. So I guess that's one good sign to see out of the government. So with tax increases, there weren't a heck of a lot packed in there, thankfully, though they did kind of kick a can down the road. What did you see in there?
Well, tax increases, that's a good, let's talk about that. Good one. So, I mean, fortunately, Premier Kenney right away came out right before the budget and said, this would be the worst possible time to be digging deeper into taxpayers' pockets. And he's right about that, obviously, right? Over the last year, tens of thousands of jobs have been lost. There's still thousands of businesses in Alberta who are at risk of closing their doors for good. So thousands more jobs are still at risk in Alberta here. So Kenny's right. It is the worst possible time to be reaching deeper into families' pockets. But unfortunately, while we didn't see the big tax hikes, the sales taxes, stuff like that, we are seeing the government increase its income tax take through a sneaky backdoor type of taxation known as bracket creep. And what's really unfortunate about all of this is that Premier Kenney, back in the day, he used to be the guy bashing bracket creep. So it's really unfortunate that we're now paying for that in Alberta.
Yeah, no, I remember it very well because bracket creep is kind of as you said, it's a sneaky one. People don't pay attention to it. It's a little bit abstract, but it's an inflation-based tax hike that's going to keep hitting you over and over. And it was a big issue in the 90s when a young Kenny was with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and I was a young volunteer with the Reform Party, and everybody was getting on Chrétien's case for doing this exact sort of thing, whilst also the not yet Premier Kenney was on Ralph Klein's case very heavily to balance the budget. Boy, things certainly changed once they changed their role.
Yeah, and Corey, if I can just jump in that, obviously the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we don't think it's a good time to be raising taxes. I mean, especially when you have this massive spending problem that we do in Alberta. But if you're going to raise taxes, at least have the spine to do that through tax rates or introducing a new tax. But what we saw in 2019 budget, Premier Kenney's first budget, is we saw him say he wasn't going to raise taxes. And then what he did was he buried bracket creep within his huge budget, right? So very sneaky. And even his own finance bureaucrats, they estimate that bracket creep is going to end up costing Albertans about $600 million by the end of next year, expecting it to cost about $196 million this year. So it's a very sneaky form of taxation, and it's definitely coming at the worst possible time.
Yeah. So now that at least the tax hikes were relatively minimal in a sense, and some hikes in service fees I saw, like campgrounds and a few things. I don't mind service fees directly for something if it's dedicated to that end of things. I mean, it's user pay, go out. If you don't want to use it, don't, and so on. Often those sort of things go into general revenue. The other end, though, then, and since he hasn't hiked taxes dramatically and he hasn't cut spending at all, so we're looking at shocking for a province, $116 billion debt we're going to be left with here. Where do we even begin to address that?
Well, let's just talk with these debt numbers for a quick second, then we can move into the spending side. But yeah, $116 billion by the end of this year. That's more than $20,000 per Albertan if the government doesn't cut spending that we're going to have to be paying back. And it's more than just debt that we have to worry about. I mean, one of the big things that I think we all need to be considering right now is interest charges, right? You don't just pay the debt. You got to pay interest charges on the debt every single year. And this year's interest charges are going to be about $2.7 billion. So that's a big budget item right there. And you know what $2.7 billion means? I mean, that's $600 per person. That's $600 that is leaving our pockets. And instead of going into something important, maybe healthcare or lowering taxes, that's going to the bond fund managers on Bay Street.
Yeah, that's something I always found as an irony on when you would get, I guess, left of center parties. And they like to screech about how they hate big business. They can't stand corporations, and they want to stand for the little guys. Yet they never blink an eye about blowing billions on interest, which, again, it's not the small business loan shark down the street who's doing this. These are big bond businesses and companies out there that are making the money out of this debt, but they seem to overlook that. And that's an interesting thing with interest. I mean, just this crazy road we're going down with COVID in the works, and I'm quite fearful about potential hyperinflation hitting us pretty soon. And to get into a bit more of the dorky economics, if that happens, usually the response from the Bank of Canada to cool down the inflation is to raise interest rates. And we saw a really horrific chain of events through the 80s and onwards with double-digit prime lending rates, which were just bankrupting people. We've got to be nervous. I mean, we're just being lucky with these low interest rates right now. I mean, a couple of points rise, and we've got a lot of people losing their homes.
Yeah, I think that is bang on, right? Like, if you want to bet that interest rates are going to remain, let's say, historically low, well, I don't think that's a very good bet for you. But regardless, right, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't exactly know what's going to happen. And that's why when governments are setting their budgets, especially in Alberta's case right now, you have to control what you can control. And what can you control? You can control the spending. But unfortunately, we saw this budget just completely blow the lid on spending. We're going to see total spending this year, Corey, at $62 billion. Now, let me give you some context, and I think this is going to make you think twice. That $62 billion in total spending is billions of dollars more than what the NDP spent in their last year in 2018, even when you account for inflation. So this government is spending billions of dollars more than the big spending NDP.
Well, yeah, and outside of things that, okay, I guess people are assuming and expecting some spending increases from the government because of the pandemic in areas of health and I guess in stimulus. I mean, it's really painful for a free enterprise guy, but I see it. If the state is going to make it illegal to do your business, they're sort of obligated to come in and try and keep your head above water until it is legal to do it again. I mean, my answer would be open the bloody businesses. Let's get these gears rolling again. But that's a bigger discussion. So with the spending, though, now some of what they're bragging about is capital projects and things they're putting into the nice Keynesian approach that we can spend ourselves rich and keep everybody working. I see that as kind of a Band-Aid, but they have done some spending on things like the Green Line and some other big capital projects.
I mean, sorry to interrupt, Corey, but my blood is boiling over here. I had to jump in. I mean, think about where we are right now in Alberta. Think about our spending problem. We have a $10 billion spending problem. If this Keynesian economics worked, we'd all be rich right by now, right? We're already spending, the Blue Ribbon panel said we were spending more per person than every other province, right? We just had the new Democrats run this type of experiment. And how did that work out? Well, I think we all know the answer here. So let's just remember that we've had massive spending in Alberta for a very long time. Like that is not the way that we're going to be able to grow our economy and get out of this. And now on growing the economy, it's not just on Premier Kenney. Right. There's things that Premier Kenney has done that's very good, like reducing the business tax to one of the most competitive tax systems in North America. He deserves credit for that. I'm sure we're going to jump into the corporate welfare side of things, which he does not deserve credit for. But it's not just on Premier Kenney. I mean, to be very blunt, we need the municipal governments in Alberta and we need the federal government in Ottawa to get their act together if Alberta is really going to be firing on all cylinders again.
Yeah, well, and then a lot of it's beyond his control, but there's things in speculation. So another big part that we'd always watch at budget time was where they're speculating the price of oil is going to go, because that's a large chunk of their royalty revenues, land sales, all sorts of things. So it looks like they've been modest in what they're projecting for oil prices, which is probably wise. I mean, you're going to burn if you really project a high oil price and it comes in low because you end up short. But governments have often done that in the past, too, where they'll lowball what they expect out of the energy. And then when they get a little bit extra money, they can try and look like heroes when they apply it to spending. What do you think of their energy projections at this point?
Well, let me just be honest with you. I mean, at the end of the day, we'll see what happens, right, in a few years with hindsight 2020. I think what you said was fair. So I'm not exactly sure how that's going to play out. But if I can go back to the point that I made just before, is in Alberta, you got to control what you can control, and that's the spending. And we're not, and we're really seeing a lack of effort from this government to find savings. Now, let me pull up something that's small, but that really goes to say a lot, right? Because you have to do the little things right if we're going to expect you to do the big things. So we see the Executive Council's budget this year increasing by $2 million. Now that's Premier Jason Kenney's shop. So right under his nose, he wasn't able to find savings. And Corey, we're talking about a very difficult time for taxpayers. We expect the government to spending our money efficiently. Well, you know what? I don't think there's too many people who are laying awake at night hoping and wishing that the Premier's shop would see its budget increase by another $2 million this year.
No, well, and that starts getting a little more political, I think. I mean, the UCP's been having a really tough time trying to retain popularity with Albertans, and they I think they're pouring a lot of money into comms because they can't seem to figure it out. I mean, their communications have been terrible. The war room has been an embarrassment. Things like that, where you're just pouring good money after bad. So I suspect there's a bit of that effort. They know it looks bad when you're pouring money into the Premier's own budget, but they see it as an area where they're trying to save their political butts a little bit. But I mean, the small things, as said, are there, and you talked about finding efficiencies. But I see a question from somebody who was pretty blunt. Where would you cut the spending, though? I mean, it's always easier to say cut. It's fair enough. Yeah. But there will be potential economic repercussions. There'll certainly be political repercussions if you cut certain areas. I mean, you cut somewhere, somebody's going to lose a job, somebody's going to be upset, and you're going to have to deal with that. So what is the Taxpayers Federation? What are the big areas we could do? I mean, the not just the little stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So first, let me just go to one thing when you said about the political implications for cutting. Well, guess what? You know where they're really going to face a pushback is when it comes time to pay for all of this, right? Because I can tell you right now, after 5+ years of economic hardships, small businesses holding on by a thread, nobody has any money to be paying for this, right? All this spending. So they're going to have to cut spending. Now, that was a great question. So let me give you three places where you got to cut. The first is across the board, right? You have to have across the board cuts. And let me tell you why. That Blue Ribbon panel on Alberta's finances said that we would spend $10 billion less every single year if our per person spending was like BC, Ontario, and Quebec, right? The most comparable provinces to Alberta. $10 billion of savings. Now, you also have to remember, too, that for the last decade plus, we have had runaway government spending. The Progressive Conservatives, they about doubled program spending in their last decade. Then you had the NDP who came in, and we all know that story, another big spending government. So when you have this type of history and this magnitude of overspending, you have to be able to find savings across the board. Now, one place that we do have to give credit to this government is in advanced education. wildly inefficient department, and they're doing what needs to be done. So you have to give kudos there. Now, the second area where there's a lot of money to be saved is in corporate welfare. Now, I'm not talking about reducing taxes on businesses across the board. That's not corporate welfare. And I'm also not talking about the government helping gyms and restaurants keep their lights on through government-imposed lockdowns and restrictions. What I'm talking about is the massive subsidies, for example, that are going to the petrochemical industry. Well, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we identified 14 different corporate welfare programs since the United Conservative government came in, totaling $5 billion. That's a ton of money right there. And finally, you really have to go to the big budget item. And the big budget item is labor costs, right? We have seen labor costs balloon since the downturn began back at the end of 2014, right? And what did we see in the private sector? Well, unfortunately, we've seen so many people lose their jobs, take significant pay cuts, right? Families having a difficult time putting food on the table. And you know what we learned through Freedom of Information requests? That you still had thousands of Alberta government bureaucrats getting pay raises during lockdowns in 2020. So that was a bit of a rant, but I hope I answered that question.
Oh, that's okay. This show's about ranting. We need to vent, hopefully productively, while we're at it. So there is a big elephant in the room, and a couple of people have mentioned things. Unions. Governments are terrified of public sector unions. They don't want to battle with them, but it seems to be kind of unavoidable. And unfortunately, a lot of union heads, they're being very well paid. I haven't heard of many of them taking pay cuts, but either way, the options seem to come down to if a courageous government can get up there, cut labor compensation. I know it hurts. It hurts for people out there, but they're still working at least. You can still work and be bringing in 5-10% less per year. And it looked like maybe he was starting to move in that direction like Klein did. They cut the MLA salaries first. They cut the gold-plated pension first, and then they cut the public sector. But I didn't hear anything in this like they're saying we're ready to start negotiating with unions and saying, look, we're not doing this out of vitriol or spite. We've just got to get our affairs in order and we can keep people working, but it'll be for less money, because the other option will be some heavy duty cuts, and it won't be the wages, it'll be the jobs.
Yeah. Let me just give me some room to run here on this one, Corey.
I give you a lot to chew on there.
Yeah, you put the ball on the tee for me, so hopefully I can get a good hack at it. So, you really set it up really well, okay? Because the last government pay cut, the last broad-based government pay cut was back in 1994. That was a 5% cut. And what did Premier Klein back in the day do? He went to the union bosses and he said, look, I'm cutting the budget. Either you take pay cuts or you lose some staff. It's up to you, right? And fortunately, the government employees decided to take a 5% cut. Now, I think if you go to government employees now, the government employees, I'm not talking about the union bosses. I'm talking about the government employees. And you say, hey, can you take a cut to help ease some of the costs on your neighbor who just got laid off? I think most government employees would be willing to do that, especially if it meant they get to keep their job. But unfortunately, the union bosses seem to be opposing any suggestion to return back to reality, right? So you got to ask these union bosses a question. How many more Albertans need to lose their job before these union bosses are willing to take a pay cut? And Corey, we did some research looking at collective bargaining in Alberta since the downturn began back in 2015, and we saw many private sector unions taking pay reductions. Why? Because they wanted to help keep their businesses afloat and they wanted to help keep their employees on staff. But we couldn't find a single government union contract that led to any pay reductions during the downturn. In fact, we found many that led to pay increases. So this is the biggest spending item that the Alberta government has. So they have to tackle it if they're going to, get their spending in order. Now, we do see them making some movement in the right direction, but they're not even going close enough. Not even close.
No, and I think if we on the ground, people, as you're saying, I can't say no sense speaking to union bosses. They're in charge and they're representing the members, but we got to reach out to the members and get them to speak upwards to their leadership and say, look, we got to start reasoning with things. The leadership are kind of in their hallowed halls, just as our political leaders are, I guess, in some ways, and they kind of lose some of the reality. And maybe some of the things too is to remind our government, like, they'll always predict doom and gloom if you cut spending, particularly if you're going to go to war with unions. But I'm admittedly old enough to remember the 90s very well. And everybody projected that if Ralph Klein took on the unions, if he cut spending for labor, he's toast. He's going to get wiped out. The Liberals are going to replace him. And the unions were there. They were literally, I remember them literally outside the legislature kicking on the doors. They broke a couple of windows. I mean, the protests were something else. And every pundit, Klein has just destroyed himself politically and everything else. So they finally went to the polls, and what happened? He won a bigger majority. And 4 more years of austerity and cleaning things up, moving towards ending our debt. We got to the point of the deficit was gone. And what happened? He got a bigger majority. And then 4 more years after that, when he started spending again, and he, started moving towards hiking spending, his popularity started to sink. So I think maybe they're not giving the voters as much credit as they should with this.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think just everyone is it's so obvious, unfortunately, Corey. We really are starting to have a bit of a class divide here in Alberta, right? Not the one that you normally hear about. Right, not businesses versus their employees, but the class divide that we're having, that we're seeing budding here in Alberta, is one between government employees and the people who have to pay their tab. Right, because government employees have been completely shielded from the downturn. Now, there's one other point that I want to make. I think what Premier Kenney and what the Finance Minister are going to have to do is they're going to have to take a look at the top of the bureaucrat pyramid. Right, they're going to have to go into the upper management bureaucrats and get them to take a significant pay cut. Because when we've done research into this, our top bureaucrats are making a ton of money, and they're making significantly more than their counterparts in other similar provinces. Let's talk about healthcare for a second. I know it's going to be controversial, but there's places to cut in healthcare. For example, we looked and we found more than 900 management bureaucrats within Alberta Health Services on the Sunshine List, right? These management bureaucrats, these aren't frontline workers. These are management bureaucrats within Alberta Health Services making big 6-figure paychecks. That's why they're on the Sunshine List. So you can't tell me that there isn't any places to be cutting, even within healthcare, right? Why do we have 900 management bureaucrats on the Sunshine List within Alberta Health Services?
Yeah, well, and the best analogy I've seen with that, with the amount of bureaucracy, not just the amount of, and this gets a little rougher, I guess, but I'm talking about perhaps reducing actual jobs, in my view. But you go to a big hospital and you look at the giant zone for staff parking, and it's just packed, hundreds and hundreds of vehicles from 9 to 5. And then at 9, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night, that staff area is down to 5% capacity. Well, people didn't stop being sick in that hospital during the other, 12, 14 hours of the day. What happened? Well, they don't need all the paper pushers during those hours. I mean, these are that's showing, and you do need administration. I understand that, but it seems to me that we could use a lot more feet on the ground in the hallways and the wards rather than in the offices and at the desks. But that takes some really frank examination and some difficult choices to make.
Well, you know what? What you're describing here in terms of inefficiencies, it is real, right? That blue ribbon panel, I keep going back to it, but it found that Alberta would spend about $3 billion less every single year if we spent like other provinces on healthcare per person. Here's another study showed that Alberta spends the second most per person in all of Canada on healthcare, and we come in just behind Newfoundland and Labrador. So we have a very big spending government healthcare system, but really it's like this across the board. So when I started that one remark about where do you find spending, and I say it has to happen across the board, it's because this is the story. This is the rule, not the exception for the Alberta government. We have a very bloated Alberta government, $10 billion spending problem. And this is why it's so frustrating when you see a budget like today, which really just lacked effort to even find savings. It really lacked the effort. Right? Why are we spending billions of dollars more than the NDP did in 2018-19 when we have such an inefficient provincial government to begin with?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of us really expected better, and I hope they understand. I mean, the bleeding support numbers leaving the Kenney government, a lot of it's not NDP people. They never liked them to begin with. These are conservatives who are dropping off. We wanted to see some fiscal responsibility here. I mean, not slash and burn, but we wanted to see something, and we're not seeing it today. To get a little looking in the crystal ball a little farther down the road, though, so they didn't, and it always comes back to this. They they didn't allow it this time, but they said we should examine a sales tax down the road. Like it's a political horror story for Albertans, yet it's a holy grail, it seems, for politicians and economists to say we've got to get a sales tax because then we can tax ourselves rich. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, there's only so much blood that you can draw from a stone, right? And our problem isn't that the government is taking too little of our money. Like that's not the problem, right? The problem is that our government spends way too much, and the government is continuing to spend. And unfortunately, the government isn't really taking this spending problem as serious or nearly as serious as it should. But I mean, look, we should be seeing Premier Jason Kenney and the finance minister outright reject the possibility of a provincial sales tax. I mean, we have a $10 billion spending problem, and the government isn't addressing it. Really isn't addressing it. We saw spending go up again this year. So I guess that's in high level what I would be saying to that. And I think you also have to remember too, just because you give a government a new tax, it doesn't mean the budget problem goes away. You know what politicians like to do with other people's money? They like to spend it, right? I sometimes get this, that every other single province has a sales tax, so Alberta should have a sales tax. Well, there's two obvious answers to that. I mean, the first one is just because other provinces are doing something bad doesn't mean we should. And the second one is, well, yeah, look at other provinces' big deficits as well. So just because you give the government and politicians another way to take more of our money, it doesn't mean the situation is going to improve in Alberta.
No, and it seems that you see a shallow assumption all the time that with a sales tax that it won't have an economic impact farther down. I mean, if you hit consumers with another 5% on everything they're going to buy, they're going to spend something less. And if they're spending less, businesses are going to cut back on what they're doing. I mean, it goes all the way down the line, and that might lead to layoffs. It has an economic impact. Proponents of sales taxes always overlook, well, it's not harmless. You're adding another tax to the economy here.
Yeah, Corey, if I can just jump in, sorry for cutting you off, but I think you just reminded me of a really good point. And it's essentially this. I mean, we have heard the finance minister say, and Premier Kenney say, now is not the right time to consider a sales tax, right? This would be the worst possible time. Our finance minister hasn't completely shut the door on the idea. And it almost seems to me like there's this idea like, well, a pandemic isn't exactly the best time to be taking more money from families. Better to wait till after the pandemic ends. But Corey, I mean, how many people do you know that just has a bucket of money laying around for after the pandemic? And remember, when the pandemic ends, Albertans will have faced more than 5 years of economic hardships, many layoffs, many pay cuts, businesses closing their doors, many businesses holding on by a thread. So just when the pandemic ends, it doesn't mean that the hardships for Albertans will magically go away. And we have to remember and be cognizant of the fact that many Alberta families and businesses have been struggling for 5+ years. So we don't have all this tax dollars just lying around on our money trees to be paying higher taxes in the future as well.
No, and I mean, the other aspect some people make, I'll just talk about the sales tax a little further because it keeps coming up. And it's usually economists who do it. They say it's a more efficient way of taxing, but I don't care. I mean, the only way I would say go for it, okay, cut the income tax to the core down to nothing and make it truly revenue neutral. And I don't trust you. Cut that first, then bring in the sales tax.
Yeah.
But until then,
first. Yeah.
All I see is another tax, and we definitely can't afford it.
Can I interject again? Sorry, but you keep teeing me up. So look, we hear economists arm wrestle over all the time over which type of tax should we think about, But I think many miss the obvious. You know what really matters to everyday Albertans? How much tax the government is taking. That is the most important thing for people's lives. Not, oh, did I pay this income tax? Did I pay this sales tax? No, it's how much money did the government take, right? Like that is what matters truly when it comes to a tax burden. Now let's talk about this revenue neutral idea. When I hear revenue neutral, to me, that's the old wolf in sheep's clothing, right? And the problem with revenue neutral anything is that it's only revenue neutral until it's not. So the government might come out and say, well, we'll put in a sales tax, we'll reduce income taxes to a smaller level. Well, what's stopping the politicians from them turning around in 2, 3, 5 years and then jacking up income taxes again, right? So we have to remember that this whole idea of revenue neutral, it really is that wolf in sheep's clothing.
Well, then another area then, which is a little bit separated from the budget, but it still impacts it, and it's coming up, and you guys have been active with that, though, is the referendum coming up on equalization. Because part of the issue we do have as Albertans, too, though, is whatever we seem to gather up, the federal government is more than happy to kind of take it away from us or give an excuse not to transfer services back to us like they typically could. It's something that's kind of not in our control, but could be in our control if we speak up on it. Where's the Taxpayers Federation landing with that referenda?
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing that up. We did launch the Fight Equalization campaign, so please go to fightequalization.ca, and it's going to be our campaign for the October 18th referendum, and we're fighting for equalization fairness, fighting against the status quo, and let's call a spade. What we need Ottawa to take their boots off our necks. Right. And look, it's equalization is very important, and we do need to fight the status quo. But this equalization referendum is much more than just about equalization. Right. It's really a way to put our legitimate grievances across the country. And we do have legitimate beefs with the rest of Canada. I mean, there's been so much research showing that we have paid more than $600 billion more to the feds than we've received back in spending since the 1960s. That's not just equalization, that's the tax and spend system at large. So we had this massive oversized contribution to the rest of Canada. Now, what do we get now, right? Well, we get politicians that seem to be getting their kicks by roadblocking our development. We had British Columbia saying that they would employ every tool in the toolbox to block our pipelines. We have the Quebec's premier. What is he calling our oil dirty energy, saying there's no social acceptability for another pipeline? And then there's the feds, right? Then there's the feds. You got Bill C-69. You have to give kudos to Kenny, by the way, who's challenging that. So that's very well done. Bill C-48, the tanker ban. Then you've got the carbon tax. The feds are getting ready to hit us with a second carbon tax. The feds rejected Northern Gateway. They moved the regulatory goalposts on Energy East. Our political and legal system chased away Kinder Morgan Company when it was trying to spend its money to build the Trans Mountain expansion. So, I mean, I see this equalization referendum as Albertans' chance to really send Trudeau and the rest of Canada a message.
Yeah, well, and budgetary wise, it's something people love bringing up all the time. And again, vapidly, it frustrates me. We should be like Norway. They got this giant fund and they saved it all, and now they're getting revenue from it. Okay, there's some truth to that, and we kind of started along that with the Heritage Fund, but Norway doesn't have a Quebec. Norway doesn't have a federal government. The EU doesn't take that sort of chunk out of that country from their revenues, so it allowed them to sock it away. I mean, sure, we might have pissed it away anyways, even if the feds didn't take it. I can't necessarily think we're that good as stewards of our own money sometimes, but it is a big factor. I mean, if Albertans want to get stirred up too, they don't want to see as much spending cuts. We need them no matter what, but don't want to see as much, and they don't want to see the tax hikes. Well, let's have a look at where some of that money is also siphoning out of us, and we're not getting a return on it.
You know what, Corey? I actually see the issue on both sides. I agree with you. Of course, I agree with you. Right? All the amount of money that we're paying in federal taxes greater than what we're getting back. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But I do see our one of the key fundamental challenges in Alberta has been the massive provincial government spending problem. The PCs, spend. The NDP, what do? Hiked business taxes, hiked income taxes, hit us with a carbon tax, and still added tens of billions of dollars of debt onto our backs. And now the United Conservative government, right? They came into power. What were they supposed to do? Fix the finances without raising taxes. And you know what? This is a challenging situation, absolutely. But they're spending billions of dollars more than the NDP, right? So I agree with your sentiment there in terms of Ottawa, and we do need to fix that. But boy, do we ever need to clean up our own backyard here in Alberta.
Oh, yeah, it's on both ends. It's one of the things with people pursuing independence in the past I talked about, particularly when we had NDP and we had Redford in, saying, look, guys, until we could prove that we could manage the province better than Ottawa, who are we to talk about separating from them? I mean, first things first, if we're just going to make a smaller version of the same thing, we're not going to be anywhere better off. So what do you think Albertans can do to help turn this around and stand up for themselves in the meantime? I mean, aside from electoral efforts.
Well, hey, I'd love for everyone to check out what the Taxpayers Federation is doing. I think that would be step one, obviously, that I would recommend. I mean, check us out at taxpayer.com, go to our newsroom. That would be fantastic. But really, we have to stay on our politicians, right? There's a famous quote that I'm not even going to try to remember because I'll butcher, but essentially what it is that the policies are really decided upon by those people who get involved, right? So we do have to stand up, we do have to be heard, and we have to remember that we still have to care about the fiscal situation here in Alberta. We still do, right? Because all of this debt, this $160 billion worth of debt that we're going to have by the end of the year is going to come due at some point. And that's why we need this government. We need to push them to do a better job finding savings. We really do need to do that.
Yeah, well, I think we kind of covered a lot of her there.
Did we solve all the world's problems?
Yeah, and to Roxanne and some of the others who put very long comments, I can't put those up on the screen because they eat the whole screen up, but people can read those on Facebook after the fact, and it's a great forum for discussion. So I just want to put a couple reminders out there before we close off as well. This Monday, we have Danielle Smith on with, I believe, Dr. John, and it's going to be a series of 6 different appearances where Danielle is going to be coming on, and it was really well received when she was on with David Redmond last Monday. So make sure to tune in for that. Subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss these live events when they come with Franco or Danielle or some of the other fine folks we talk to around here. We're also, yes, there's been a soft paywall. Some people have commented on that with the Western Standard site. You get a limited number of free stories, and then a subscription is kind of required. We're growing. We're trying to get it out to you. We give as much as we can. Just always remember, it was only 15 years ago. You wouldn't think twice before spending $18, $20, $30 a month for a newspaper subscription. A few bucks for an online version, can be well worthwhile for you. And don't forget our sponsor again at Kieran's Way. So thanks again, Franco. And one more time, it's a Canadian Taxpayers Federation. What's the URL for you guys?
And check us out at taxpayer.com.
Nice and easy to remember. Okay, thanks, Franco. I'm sure we'll be talking again soon.
Hey, my pleasure. Chat soon.